I'm Peter Jennings in New York. Just a short while ago, astonishing news from East Germany, where the East German authorities have said, in essence, that the Berlin Wall doesn't mean anything anymore. The wall that the East Germans put up in 1961 to keep its people in will now be breached by anybody who wants to leave. The East German media chief in the Communist Party said a short while ago that anyone who wants to leave East Germany and go anywhere in the world is free to do so. Anyone who wants to leave East Germany and travel to the West and return will need a visa, but visas will be granted, it is said, immediately or at least urgently by police stations all over the country. It is perhaps the most important announcement made in Central Europe since the end of World War II, certainly since the wall went up in 1961.
Throughout the turbulent Cold War, the town of Berlin was altered by a physical and idealistic border. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader at the time, hoped building the wall would bring happiness and prosperity to the Soviet Union. The Berlin Wall separated Berlin, Germany, into two parts. West Berlin was part of West Germany, which was a democratic nation, very alike to the United States. East Berlin was occupied by communist leaders, trying to implant their ideas in the minds of thousands. As a turning point in history, the citizens of East Berlin learned how to adjust to a world that almost no one else has had to live in. The Berlin Wall was a major symbol of the Cold War. So when the wall fell in 1989 and the Cold War came to a close, it ended a 50-year feud between the United States and the Soviet Union. From the 1950s into the early 1960s, thousands of people from East Berlin crossed over into West Berlin to reunite with families and escape communist repression. In an effort to stop that overflow, on August 12, 1961, the government of East Germany began to close off all possible points of entrance into West Berlin from East Berlin by hanging up barbed wire and posting sentries. In the weeks to come, construction of a concrete block wall began, with sentry towers and minefields around it. The Berlin Wall succeeded in completely sealing off the two sections of Berlin. The U.S. government responded angrily. Commanders of U.S. troops in West Berlin even began to make plans to bulldoze the wall, but gave up on the idea when the Soviets moved armed units into position to protect it. The West German government was furious with America's quick retreat and lack of action, but President John F. Kennedy believed, quote, "A wall is a heck of a lot better than a war." In an attempt to let the West Germans know that the United States was not abandoning them, Kennedy traveled to the Berlin Wall in June 1963 and famously stated, quote, "Ich bin ein Berliner." I am a Berliner. On a side note, since the word Berliner was commonly referred to as a donut throughout Germany, Kennedy's use of German grammar was also translated to "I am a jelly donut," which was clearly not the intended meaning. However, Kennedy's intended meaning was that both he and all of America stood together with West Berlin in its rivalry with the communist East Berlin. During the time the Berlin Wall was up, it became a major symbol for the Cold War. In newspapers in America and around the world, the Berlin Wall was the subject of many magazine and newspaper headlines. The Soviet Union could not get access to these papers, so their newspaper headlines described how the wall protected them from the evils of the West. An interesting fact to note about the Berlin Wall is on the West Berlin side, you can see graffiti and signs written on the wall, drawn by people who felt they needed an outlet to express themselves. East Berliners, on the other hand, were not even allowed near the wall, for fear they might escape. At least 10,000 people tried to escape, the most famous story occurring at Checkpoint Charlie, a key checkpoint between the communist and democratic side, describing an 18-year-old Peter Fetcher, who climbed the wall but bled to death in West Germany, because the East German guards refused to let anybody touch it. Okay, so we want to know, how did the Berlin Wall impact your life? Was it a big part, or?
Well, I was born in Germany when the wall was already there, so it was a part of life.
Yeah.
I didn't know any better. So there was the wall, and how it impacted people is pretty much we weren't allowed to travel anywhere west. So we were only allowed to travel to the former Soviet Union, former Czechoslovakia, and those countries.
Okay.
Bulgaria, Romania. And so that, I think, was something that kind of influenced us. But from a daily perspective, there was a wall and that was it. I think it impacted my mom in a different way, because she was born in Berlin, she lived in Berlin, and she worked at a hospital or was studying there, and that hospital was part of what then would become West Berlin. And when they put up the wall in the middle of the night on August 13th, 1961, in the morning, she couldn't go to that hospital anymore. So there was a wall.
By the 1980s, the US and the entire world was willing to do whatever it took to have the wall come down. While Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union in 1985, he immediately began implementing democratic reforms in the Soviet Union. He introduced the idea of glasnost and perestroika, helping the wall come down. Glasnost was a Soviet policy allowing the discussion of political and social issues in the public. Perestroika introduced the reconstruction and reform of the Soviet Union. President Reagan's speech in 1987 was a turning point for the better when he stood in front of the wall and said his most famous line as a president, quote, "Mr. Gorbachev, please tear down this wall." Reagan loathed the Berlin Wall. Quote, "It's a wall that should have never been built," he often said. As early as 1967, while still governor of California, he said the U.S. should have knocked down the barbed wire separating East and West Berlin the moment the communists put it up. Neither Reagan nor Gorbachev were responsible for the wall coming down. They both credited the public for using their own weight and power to bring it down. In his speech, Reagan said that if Gorbachev truly sought peace and liberation, the wall would come down itself. Then, in May of 1989, Austria and Hungary opened their borders to East Berlin citizens. In a little over 3 days, 13,000 East Berlin citizens had escaped to Hungary. The East Berlin leader at the time, Erich Honecker, and his entire cabinet resigned in October of 1989, bringing to power Egon Krenz. While Krenz still wanted free democratic elections, he was still communist, and later received a 6.5-year jail sentence for the manslaughter of refugees who tried to escape to the west. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall was officially broken. Hugh Cross, a 65-year-old retiree, said, quote, "That night you couldn't stop people. They lifted the barrier and everyone poured through. We saw it first on TV. Normally it was very quiet up here, but that night we could hear the footsteps of those crossing. Tap, tap, tap. All hell was breaking loose there." While the wall was built quickly, it took months for the public and other countries to have the wall completely torn down. When the wall came down, Dieter Munke said to reporters, quote, "We were shocked when we heard that announced, simply astonished. The next morning we went straight to visit my aunt in the West." Dieter, a high school teacher at the time, said he had long been fascinated with West Germany. Quote, "I was born in East Germany, I went to school in East Germany, I was supposed to teach the kids about the wonderfulness of the East, while I was secretly watching TV from the West," he said. Overall, the Berlin Wall provided a unique situation that people had to live with and adapt. The Berlin Wall was just an example of true power and dictatorship. At the end of 29 years, citizens of East and West Berlin were just relieved to be with their families again, political views put aside. Merkel, a retiree who had witnessed the wall come up and down, was quoted on November 10, 1989, saying, quote, "This is not just a day of celebration for Germans. This is a day of celebration for the whole of Europe. This is a day of celebration for all those who want more freedom."